All right, Coco, say hi. It's the last video of the year, last topic of the year. Come on. You worried? You don't like sitting on a chair? Okay, it's fine. All right, I'll let you down. Here we go. Off we go. Onto the bed. You ready? You want to teach? No, okay. All right. Hi, everyone. Last video, as you sort of heard me saying to Coco. Honestly, last topic of the year, we are 2/3 of the way to a full stack. I would say 85% of the way to a full stack application. Last part is just integrating the database portion. So actually having a place to store our information rather than just an array for our dealership that we had before. In this video, I will talk about the way that we're going to be doing it, and then towards the tail end, we'll actually implement it. Honestly, it's not as difficult as you may think it is. Once you have everything set up and you've made your accounts, which I'll talk about in a moment, it's relatively straightforward. So let's talk about where we are at and where we have been. Let me close the door here. All right, so we created our app with Express. We created our app using React. We integrated the two. We have been able to send, post, and put and delete. Hopefully you did put because I didn't do it, but make sure that you implement it. And we were able to make our app be able to talk to each other. And again, the limitation that we had was mostly that the dealership server that I had running was just an array that we created that we were adding to and removing from. And so it wasn't living anywhere. It wasn't a live document, so to speak. It was just living inside of that file. So what we're going to be doing is essentially integrating an actual server that's running. You're putting information on the cloud. And yeah, that's essentially it. So let's talk about databases and servers. So before, I would say, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, SQL, which you may have run into before, was the way to go for having a database. And in fact, this course used to be, and I think it's still listed as like SQL, or as having SQL in it. When I first took this class back in the day, and I took it with Nelson, it was a lot of SQL stuff. And this right here sort of summarizes what using an SQL database is. It's just a table with different properties, and you would essentially add rows to the table on the left side over here and associated properties. So typically you had to have an ID, you had to have information to fill in for all of these. You would be able to like insert, remove, select, all the different things that we are able to do with our REST operations. We could do there. But it is very restricting. It's very annoying to use, in my opinion. And you essentially have to base everything that you are sending and removing on being able to fit it into a table like this. So having, for example, having information be embedded within itself is kind of annoying, not impossible, kind of annoying to do, which is why we're moving away towards doing that. So what are we at now? So we're at a point where more often than not, when you're seeing a database, it is a NoSQL database. So that means that it's not using SQL, and it is a little bit more free in the way that it works. So you get to decide what fields are there. And it kind of looks like a JSON, to be honest. It's just like a JavaScript object. So you can decide the data type, what is inside of it. You can make arrays inside of it, objects inside of it, different subdocuments, like all these different things that you can do and have been used to with JSONs. We can do super easily with a NoSQL database. So typically, I mean, there's lots of different ways. So not different ways, but there's lots of different NoSQL databases. Let me look up a list here. Not explain, but let me see if you give me a list of them. Okay, maybe not. I mean, it is on Mongo, so it's not gonna. Let's find a list. Key value. Object. Okay, I might just abandon this. Okay, I'm not going to go even further. Examples. Okay, here's a good one. All right, so relational, popular. Okay, so here are a lot of the different popular ones. Mongo, again, is the one that we're going to, well, not again, but it is the one that we're going to be using. Couch, HBase, Oracle, all of these different ones, I'm sure, have their different specialties, and people who use them are pretty, they like to cling on to the one that they like to use. But we are going to be using Mongo. Mongo is very popular. So let me look at MongoDB. Let's see if it gives us a figure for won't necessarily give us a figure for how many people are using it, but just know that it's one of the most popular. I forget what the percentage was of apps are using MongoDB. You can see right here that essentially all of these sites are using MongoDB as its database because it's pretty lightweight, pretty easy to use, and pretty customizable. So we'll get back to that website and creating MongoDB or creating a MongoDB connection in a second. But essentially what this is, so it's a key value pair, so keys and values, what we've been used to so far in the year. So what is Mongoose? Mongoose is what is living on top of MongoDB and also allowing us to communicate with MongoDB. So for Node, essentially think of Mongoose as that wrapper for being able to communicate for MongoDB using Node or using Express in our case, which again is living on top of Node. So think of Node, Express, Mongoose. And so it's very easy to throw around Mongoose and MongoDB. Just know Mongoose is specific for communicating and being able to do all of our REST operations with MongoDB. MongoDB is the actual database, though. So that is where all of our information is being held and stored. And so Mongoose is communicating with that. All right, so the important parts of Mongoose. And so these are all things that you will see in a moment. So collections are the actual pieces of data. So each of the individual entries are called collections. Let me show you an example. Let me pull up the site here. So for example, let me show you mine. And this we'll get to in a moment. Collections. Okay, so a collection is the individual collection of information. So all of the information that you have. So for example here, I have 2 cars in my database inside of my collection. So you can have multiple collections inside your apps, and you'll be creating an app or a project in this class, and you can create more and more and more, and the collection is the actual information there. So next one, document. The document is the individual record that we're adding in. We will be, so this for example is a document. We will be creating the rules for what the document has to have inside of it. For example here, I created a rule, and I'll show you how to do it, for a brand, a year, and a type to be what is inside of that document, along with the time and also an ID for that object. And you'll be able to see that. So documents the individual entries. Collection is all of the entries that are on this database. Let's get back here. And fields, again, are the individual portions in there. So like brand, year, model, all those different things. Those are the fields. So from there, talking about rules. Schemas are what we define as the rule or the shape of the data that you're going to be managing inside your database. So in other words, for this database that I have, this collection right here, I made a rule that this was what the entries were going to look like. So the schema that I created was so that this is what is consistently added into the database. And so this will be what's in it. So we will be able to define our schema. We'll be able to sort of mix and match what information we want to add in there. And the different types that you can use are limited to these different things. And you have to define what each individual type is. It's not as forgiving as, I don't know, JavaScript in general is, where you can just do let var equal, and you can make it a string or a number or whatever. In this case, you do have to define ahead of time, so that way it knows what sort of information there. And again, the big reason for this is because we want to be able to have our code be validated, or information more like it be validated and correctly placed where it needs to be. And so you need to be specific. All right. Last part here, I believe. Yeah, last part here. So based on the schema, so the rules that we create, we will create a model. And so this is essentially where we will be communicating with the database, so actual MongoDB. So the model itself is being created based on the schema, and then we will be able to communicate from there. So for example here, using Node, in our case Express, we're using Mongoose to create a model for how we're going to be communicating between MongoDB and our application. And so the model itself is what is mapping the information between Node and that server, or yeah, that database itself. I think that's about it for that. Those are different parts. I'm not going to quiz you on those parts. It'll make more sense once we get started with creating, with actually tacking this onto our app, but hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. All right, so actually using, well, this shouldn't say Mongoose, this should say MongoDB. Using MongoDB. All right, so there's a couple of different ways that you can use MongoDB. So you can download the app and create an account, or you can also just use the free cloud version. I'm going to be using the cloud version. I do have it downloaded and installed on my computer, and I have an account, but it's up to you. So let's go ahead and go there, and I've already had it open. But MongoDB here, I am going to go to try free. In here, create an account. I'm not going to create one because I already have one. And then when you're in. I'm going to go ahead and sign in here, even though I'm already technically signed in. All right. Let me get to a point. Okay. So this should hopefully be roughly what your should look like, your MongoDB. Okay, never mind. I was thinking maybe making another account so that I can see where you all are, but you should be around here. So what I recommend you do is you create a new project. I'm going to call this one CMSC. create 9n. Hit next. I don't want to add any other members. Create the project. All right, now I've created the project, and if you create multiple ones down here, you can switch between them if you would like. In here, we are going to be creating a cluster. So the cluster is actually going to be the connection to the server, where all of your information is going to be held for that database. So use this one right here. I don't recommend you use a paid one. You don't need to. So go to create a cluster at free. When we're here, I mean, it's up to you which one you want to use, but I typically just stick with AWS and click Northern Virginia. And you shouldn't have to change anything else here. You can just create the cluster. If you've ever lived in Northern Virginia, which I used to, my wife used to as well, where these servers are for AWS, it's really creepy. It's just giant buildings. They're unmarked. They just look like giant warehouses, and all they have are ginormous air conditioning units at the top to keep all these servers running and cooled and everything. They kind of creep me out. I'm not gonna lie. I really don't like weird empty buildings. Not that anyone probably does, but anyway, I digress. So create a cluster based on that. You shouldn't have to change anything there. And it's going to create your cluster. Give it a moment. Deploying your changes. Let's give it a moment. When this is ready, we will be able to click connect here. And be able to set a user for our cluster, a password for it, and then generate a link so that we can directly communicate with this database. So we'll wait in a moment. Let's see if there's anything else. That's not ready. Okay. Let me just move on to the next slide, and we can talk about this real quick. Even though we haven't quite gotten to the coding part, this will be helpful for you. So once we have set up our connection, which should be easy, it'll be a lot of copying and pasting, and we have set up our users and all that different stuff. Essentially what it all boils down to is before we had our React app, and it would send it would send requests using fetch to our /dealership router, and in there we would process the get, the delete, the put, the post, all those different things inside of whatever the router name is .post, or whatever the router name is .delete. We talked about that in the previous video. Now, all we are going to have to do in order to actually communicate that same information to our database and have it stored there rather than that array is we're going to be using one of these methods here. And so you will be able to write and use however many of these you would like. But I'm going to highlight a few that are going to come in handy that we're going to be using more often than not. So there's lots of different deletes, lots of different finds, lots of different replacing and all those different things. And so you will honestly not have to do a whole lot of work here. It's essentially you saying, what do you want to find, for example, here, what do you want to find? And then write a callback function so that it actually runs that thing. And does something based on whether it finds it or not. And that's about it, essentially. So once we've created the connection, we've created the model, we've created the schema, we are essentially going to be using these different functions so that we take the information that was just passed to it from fetch from our React, and then in our router, we pass it on to our database using one of these functions, and then we're good to go. That's essentially it. So we're going to be using probably 4 of these, one for post, one for put, one for delete, one for get, and that's about it. It's honestly relatively simple. So let's see if our cluster is ready. Okay, it's ready. So in here, we can see there's lots of different metrics, and you'll be able to see, this is probably the most important one for you all. Once we're able to actually connect to this router, to this database, you'll be able to see it here, and that'll sort of be able to confirm that you're actually making a connection there. So first things first, go ahead and click connect here once it's ready. And notice it's going to say you can't connect yet, set up your firewall access. So first things first, we're going to have to whitelist your IP address for your current computer so that it knows that, okay, this computer is trying to communicate with this database. That's totally fine because it's you. So go ahead and click add. Your IP address should automatically show up there. Please don't use mine. Click add. It's added, and then you can write a username and a password. Up to you what you want to use. I'm going to stick to the simple DB user and DB user password. DB user password. And then click create. Let's not do that. All right, then we'll be able to choose a connection method. So what we're going to be using specifically is connect to your application. And in here, make sure that it's on Node.js 3.0 or later, which is perfectly fine. We could probably, 3.0 or later. It's perfectly fine. And we're going to be using this connection string in a moment. Is this full driver? Tell me. Oh, interesting. But we're going to be using this connection string. You can deal with the full driver if you want to poke around with that a little later. But essentially what we're going to be doing is we're going to be using this to establish a connection. We're going to replace here, here, our password, and then we'll be good to go for setting up a connection. So I'm going to click copy, and I'm going to copy this real quick. And I will... What's happening? Oh, it's just saying it's running. Okay. I'm going to pause the video real quick. You probably won't see a difference, but let me clear some of the code that I have on there, and we'll slowly set this up so that we can get to a point where we can establish a connection. So here we go. Okay, let's jump into it. So first things first, there's going to be a couple of things that I've already pre-filled in that I'm not going to sit here and type out for you, mostly because I will make sure to give you this example, and I've starred all of the parts that need to be added in after the Express, how should I say it, the Express app, the default Express app that we created to create our back end. So you'll see these stars later. I'll explain what each part is, but just know that those are the lines that you can literally copy and paste. You'll be able to change some stuff here and there, but stuff that you'll be able to copy and paste into your code. First things first that I want you to create is inside of your routes folder. You can do it somewhere else if you really want to, but inside of your routes folder is where I created mine. We are going to create our schema. Now, what is this? Our schema is essentially deciding what the formatting for our database is going to look like. So for our example, notice here there's year, type, brand, this created at, updated at, all that sort of stuff. I'm deciding that here. So I decided that I want year, brand, and type to be the pieces of information that are in my collection. And then you can add this if you want. This essentially adds the timestamps for when you added that thing in there. But that's essentially it. So here we create an instance of schema. We grab the schema portion, and then we will create an instance of that. So we're essentially grabbing a class here, creating an instance of it, and we initialize it to whatever information we would like inside of that schema. And you can separate them out by commas. Once we use that, then what I did was created a model, and this is typically how it's done. You'll see in other examples if you Google them on the internet. People do this a lot as well. We export the model that we create using that schema, and we'll be using it later on. And so make sure you have something similar to this. Whatever you choose to create, whatever information you choose to have in there, again, make sure that you decide the type here. You're not initializing it to anything, you're just deciding on the type, and it's just going to be essentially a skeleton for whatever information you decide to add in. So this is about it. Make sure you create it at the same level as your router. All right, now that you've created that, let's go look at dealership.js. And I'll go line by line here and talk to you about each of the pieces of information that you need to add in. First two, these are the important ones for making sure that you have the supporting files that you need. So first things first, you have to require Mongoose. Make sure that you've installed it ahead of time, npm install Mongoose. You can also make sure that you require the data, which is the schema and the model that we just created, essentially the model because that's what we're exporting, and we store that inside of data. Now, anytime we want to interact with our database, we are going to be using data. So you can change this to whatever you want, but just know that that's how we're going to be calling find or delete by ID, all these different things that we just talked about in the previous slide. In here, all of these different methods we'll be able to call on whatever instance or whatever constant we create here, which is essentially the exported model that we created down here. So schema, model, and then on that model we are able to call all of our different methods to interact with our database. All right, next thing there, this constant for the database route. What this is what we just copied from our Mongo server or our database. Let me go back here, overview. So for example, for me, let me go to connect here. Again, connect this. Make sure you copy this directly, and then you paste that in here. And also something that I always see people do when they're doing this, and it causes it to run into issues. Notice that there's the carets here. Don't include those carets. So don't put the password in between the carets. Just replace the whole thing that says password with your password. So for example, for me, it was dbuser. So I replaced the whole thing, including the carets, with dbuser. And so yours will be unique. Make sure you paste that in there. Don't use mine. And I'll probably, when I put this example up, I'll probably delete this URL anyway. Next, make sure you have this line right here. This essentially creates the connection with this router, and then use the URL parser. You don't really have to touch this. There's other settings that you can use, but this is just a default. Just leave that in there. I won't go down the line of explaining exactly what that property is. Next, you create that connection. So you do mongoose.connection. You put this in a variable. The reason for that is then you can do these two lines right here, and I would recommend you put those in there. These are mostly for you to be able to tell if you've made the connection or not. We did this with the HTTP module way back when we did like on connected, and then we ran a callback function. The same thing here. So we established the connection. If the connection works, then we do connect to the database, and then you'll be able to see that here in your where is it? I'll be able to show you later on, but I don't see where it says connected to database. Oh, here it is, connected to database. So you'll be able to see if it actually made that connection properly or not. So if you see that in there, somewhere in there, you might have to dig in deeply, but it's there. So either it'll throw an error and it'll tell you what the error is, or it'll say that it connected. So this is just more for your own debugging. Now, from there, we have just our normal stuff. So the rest of this is the stuff that we have in there. We have our router.get, .post, .delete, and that's about it. So in here is where we will be able to write using our model. We'll be able to write to our database and grab information from our database using all those different, all those different methods that we have here. So the ones that we'll really care about are find by ID in some cases, find by ID and delete if we want to delete things. So what else? Update one. That's going to be useful for put. I'm not going to talk about put, but it'll be useful for put. Find one and remove. You could also use that for deleting if you want to do it by query instead of ID. Delete many if you want to drop many. Fine. I think that's about it. Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to start with find here because that's going to be the basis. And notice here that I have router.get, right? And this is grabbing the entire dealership. So that's the purpose of this specific get request. Now, if we want to be more specific and say get this specific thing, we'll be able to do that. We've talked about that before, and I highly recommend that you figure out how to do that. If you can't quite figure it out on Monday, I will most likely be able to do that in the last video / office hours that I'll do. I can talk about that, but I want to give you the chance if you want to figure it out on your own. But let me go ahead and show you how to get the entire database, so whatever is already on there. Now, I already went through and I have 2 elements in my database. So if I go to collections and I'm using specifically datas, I have 2 entries already in there that I've added before for this purpose. You yourself, you won't have anything in there until you add a post method, which we'll talk about in a moment, which is honestly one of the easiest ones. And yeah, so this should directly correlate to whatever the name of your model is. So yeah, you'll be able to see it in there once you create it. All right, so what should I write in here? So we want to start with our model name, so data. And we're starting with our model again because our model is that communication between us and the database. It's the actual Mongoose that we care about. So data.find. And if I don't give it a query and I just give it a callback function, and I just do function error comma data. This is going to grab all of the pieces of information from that database. So what I can then do is say if it's an error, which actually is not error, if error, then I'm going to return the response.json of, and this I'll talk about in a moment why I'm doing this specifically. I'm going to do false, error. Okay, so first things first, to break out of this data .find function, we will return. So that's just to get out of there. And then, similar to what we did before, we say our response to this GET request to our actual dealership, we are responding with a JSON that says it was not successful and that this is our error. Now, what this is going to do is this JSON is what I will have to handle inside of app.js. So in my GET request, which I'm doing twice here, so I fetched twice in my component.didMount and get data, I would have to handle that in there. So I would have to say, if it's an error, then do this. If it's not an error, then do that. And I'll leave that up to you to figure out, but essentially that's what it does there. So I would recommend you do it here. Once you've already parsed it down to a JSON, you can say dealer.error. If it's an error, then don't post that into the state. If it isn't, then you can go for it. And so that's the reason why I created this success false. If you go up to state, I went ahead and added success equals true up here. Again, that's just for your own purposes, so that if you do make a request that is wrong, you can write an if statement and say, oh, okay, my state for success was false, then I probably shouldn't do this action and change the state or something like that. But that's about it. Okay, so that's if there's an error. And you can use error to print out whatever the error is if you would like to say 404, I don't know, whatever the issue is there inside of app. And again, you can custom make this to do it. If you wanted to just cut out immediately when it gives an error, then that's up to you as well. You can just throw a 404 in here and get it all over with. But that's what I'll choose to do right now in this example. All right, so else, we don't really have to have an else, but I'm going to do it because I like to. I'm going to return a JSON. So I'm going to do response.json. Again, we're returning because we want to break out a data.find, and then we're responding with a JSON. And I'm going to do a similar thing. I'm going to say, I'm going to respond with a JSON of success is true. And then our info, I'm going to call it info because I don't want to call it data since we already have something referred to as data here. The info that it's responding with is data. Now, what is it going to respond with? It's going to respond with everything that's inside of that array. So either it's going to give, or sorry, inside of that database. So either it's going to give me the error or it's going to give me the actual information. And so that information is what I'm passing back to our request, which is here. This is parsing it down to a JSON, and then now dealer is what this is right here. So dealer contains success is true and info is data. And so data, again, is the response of all of the contents of my database. So what I did here, if you go back and see what the changes I made the dealership dealer.info, because that is, this JSON is dealer, info is the actual data. So it gives me the data of everything in that database. So that's the quick change that I made from the previous video into this right here. Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and see if this works. So again, I have two pieces of information. I have two entries in here, 2012 Ford Fusion and a 2016 Fiat 500. And this should hopefully, again, just to give us our life cycle here, this, when it immediately mounts, it's going to fetch the dealership. So it's going to go to this router over here. It's going to get its response, parse it to a JSON, and then that JSON, it's going to grab the dealer, so the JSON itself, dealer.info. So the JSON is called dealer, it's info attribute, and it's going to assign and change the state, so the dealership itself that contains all the cars, to the info part. So taking this, so the fetch at dealership, let's run to the router real quick. So up here, we've established our connection with Mongoose. Now what it's going to do, or sorry, MongoDB using Mongoose. Now we use data.find. Again, we didn't give it a query here. We just used the callback function because I want to grab all of the pieces of information from our database. We created a callback function, which we can say if there's an error or there's a data. And again, this is a predefined callback function, so just write it exactly like this. If there's an error, it responds with success being false. So that means dealer over here, which is the JSON parse of the response, the parse JSON. Parse response JSON. Okay. Dealer will have a condition of success being false, which again, you can use that if you want to say don't render, don't change the state now if it was false. If the response was false. And then it'll respond with the error if you want to use that error. Over here, if it was successful, then we can respond with a JSON saying the success was true, and then the info that, or the info attribute of this JSON response is the actual data that it got from the database. Hopefully, that's a little bit of a handbook, but hopefully that makes sense. And pause this video right now. Make sure that you can make those connections. Where is it going from? Where is it coming from? All those different things, and hopefully it'll make some sense. All right, so let's go ahead and save this. I'm going to go to Node, or not Node. I'm going to go to my Git bash, and I'm going to run npm start. Let's see what happens. Again, this should automatically run, and it should automatically post all or get all of that information because I used the component rendering. Why is that word escaping me? Component did mount. So I use that, so it should automatically do it. So now I can see it did it. Because I already had later on, I again created that list that we've had before, where it takes the state here, I have this already there, which is essentially creating the ordered list of the state. And so because it initially makes that GET request using component.didMount, it's going to update the dealership state, which is then going to trigger because now the document or the virtual DOM is not in sync with the real DOM because the virtual DOM now has the state of dealership that contains cars inside of it. Now it's going to render again. It's going to trigger this to go through all of the cars and print out the brand, the model, and the year. The one thing that I did change here, and I didn't talk about this before, again, in my data, I changed model to be type simply because model is already a predefined method, so I didn't want to deal with having problems with that. So I changed it to type. So anytime you see model, just assume that it's the same thing as type, just to make it easier. In the future, I'll make sure not to use a dealership example, probably, because the model is very confusing, because it's something that you need for Mongoose, but also is technically relevant for my JSON. But anyway. All right, hopefully that makes sense. And so if I go back as well, I can click Get Data. Doesn't give me any errors. And again, Get Data, all that is a, oops, this is not the correct one. Express. No, this is not it either. Another example. Okay, here it is. Okay, here it is. All right, so again, that get is this get data, which all it does is call my function for making a get fetch. Which is this right here. All right, let's move on. So I've already written that. One thing I do want to say, actually, if we do want to make a query, so again, I'm leaving this up to you to figure out how using requests.body, the parameters inside of this router right here. So like, let's do here. I could do this to search for a specific query. The way that I do that using data.find though, is I can insert in here an attribute from the JSON, and it'll query based on those attributes that you pass in. So for example, if I pass in year is 2016, then it'll query all of my model to find any cars that have a year of 2016. So in this case, if I go back and take a look at mine, it should give me back just the Fiat 500 here, because that's the only one with the year of 2016. So let me cancel this and run it again. Okay, and notice here it only rendered that one because it only, when it made the GET request, it queried it based on that one thing, the year 2016. And again, you can add more in there, like you can do brand is fiat, and so on and so forth if you wanted to. But I'm just going to leave it up to you to figure out how to do that. And otherwise, if you just write the callback function, it'll get everything there. All right, so that's using get. Start with that. Make sure that you're able to make the connection. You won't be able to test it just yet until you've posted elements into your database. Speaking about posting, let's go ahead and talk about posting. So I'm gonna minimize this, and let's talk about it. I've already pre-written post, honestly, because it's probably the easier one, and it makes more sense for you to see all of it written out. There we go. Essentially, what we need to do is we create an instance of the model. So an instance of this. We create a data entry, essentially. And again, this should go with that. Creates an instance of a model. And then we add to it each individual part of the schema. So my schema has a year, a brand, and a type. So I assigned data.year, because, again, this is called data because I called this variable data. Let's call it something else. I'm going to call it po, because I'm posting it. Po.year. I need to learn that shortcut to change all. Okay, there we go. All right, so what this does now is it creates an instance of that data. It adds to the schema, and what I added to it was the request.body.year, the request.body.model, request.body.brand. Where is it getting that request.body? Again, in our post here for put data, we added that in over here by saying body is the JSON version of data, and data is the parts of the state that we wanted to grab from. All right, and so you're getting that information there, and then all you do is PO, which is my model here, dot save, and then I pass in there the information. So I pass in po.save, and then we write a callback function here where either it works, so if there's an error, then we return success is false again for your own purposes to see if it doesn't actually work, then you can print out the error message because it'll respond with that error message. Versus if it did work, it'll give you success is true, and you can use that information as you may to say, oh, it worked properly. Or you can just let it sort of drift away as I'm doing. Let's go ahead and test this out. So let me make sure that this is working properly. Dealership options, post, dealership, good. Right. Let's go back here. And I'm going to stop this. I'm going to run it again. Okay, and again, my post is with this one right here, this submit button over here. So I'm going to go ahead and do, actually, before I do that, let me go to the database real quick and let's make sure that we're connected. And you can see there's one connection, so we're good. And also you can confirm the connection by looking up here to see if it connected to the database, and it says connected to database right here. So we're good to go. So let's go ahead and add in here Jaguar F type, and it's a 2017. I submit. Notice it popped up here. And let's see if it showed up in our collection. Loading the document. Fiat 500, Ford Fusion, and it worked. So we're good to go. Honestly, I think post is the easiest one, which hasn't always been the case, but you know, it's pretty easy. Once you've made an instance of whatever model you've created, and you're good to go from there. All right, and then last but not least, delete. Um, do, do, do. For delete, we are going to. I'm going to tell you exactly how to do it, but it's going to make it a little bit weird because the example that I'm using doesn't have IDs. I'm going to talk about this at the very end as something that I'm going to require you to do for the final project, but for this one I didn't do it. So essentially what we're going to use is data, again, because that's our model, dot find let's actually do find one and actually no, let's do find ID. ID and delete. Check and remove. Find. Okay. And then we can pass in the request body ID, and the error. I'm going to go ahead and copy this from our post because it's going to do the exact same thing. Add one more curly brace there. Okay, so there we go. All right, so again, this is a purely hypothetical. Oh shoot, this should be find ID and remove. So if I was using ID, and I'm going to tell you that you really should be whenever you're adding an entry into your database, you can essentially keep a counter in your state. So anytime that there's a post request, you just add one, and then you make a unique ID for every single one. This makes it so much easier to remove specific elements if you know the ID for it. So for example, if I had a school as my full stack application and I was looking for a student to remove, I would just put in their ID, then I can use find ID and remove, and it'll remove it. And then it does the same thing that it does for post here. So if there's an error, then it responds with success is false and responds with the error. Otherwise, it just says that it's true, and you can use that in your individual fetch earlier how you would, if you would like. I think that, let me pause real quick. Okay. All right. Last thing I sort of want to verify there before I talked about it. Find one and remove, which is the other one. You can add in here similar to your post, where you could, or sorry, not post, get, where you could add a query at the very beginning. Here you can also add a query to say, you can find one with a year of 2016, then remove it. And so that is how that would work. So let's test out and make sure that this works. Let me make sure that my delete is set up properly. So it's delete, blah, 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 blah. Deletes my brand there. Okay, that should work just fine. Start. All right, so I have 3 elements inside of my database. You can verify that again. There's 3 things here. I'm going to go ahead and delete the one that I just put in there. So I'm going to delete the record by saying it is a brand, sorry, not brand, Jaguar F-Type 2017. Submit. And what just happened? Oh, whoops. I messed up here. In my dealership, I removed, so I didn't use the request year. I should have done that. So I should have done request.body.year instead of 2016. So even though I submitted the request to delete that specific car, I deleted the first one that I found with the year of 2016. So in here, you'll be able to say specifically. And if you want to do more than one, again, you just separate by the comma and say this specific car with this specific type, model, year, delete that specific one. And if you want to use put, you again just use one of the other functions. You can do find one and update, for example, or find one and replace if you would like. They're all slightly different, but they do roughly the same thing. All right. I think that's about it for all of this. We've gotten to the point where we have created something with a front end. It's not very pretty because I'm leaving that up to you. Designed a front end using React. We've communicated to our back end using Express and Fetch. And then we're communicating to our database using Mongoose. That's about it. Now the world is yours. You can sort of figure out how to tinker with it, how to update things, and how to make your site a little more pretty and based on what you want to do. But this is a highly marketable thing that you can put on your resume and know that you know how to do full stack application creation. So on Monday, watch out for, I'm going to do my own case study as I used to do, where I would talk about something and then do a case study about halfway through the week. I'm going to do that next week to help you out with any sort of loose ends here. So for example, for put, I didn't talk about put. I want you to try and implement it yourself. But if you can't, then on Monday I can do that and talk to you all about that. So please come with questions during office hours on Monday, and I will do my demo, and I'll also answer any sort of questions that you all have there. All right. Have a wonderful day, and watch out for the final exam, which I will be posting in about, probably by the time you've seen this video.